We're supposed to have that one, I just did that one.
Also. Whose phone is that? Please turn your ringer off. Turn your ringer off.
Whoever it is, turn it off.
I think I'll go ahead and get everyone started. For those of you that are joining by Zoom, I'm going to pull this mask down a little bit so there's some clarity. Sometimes it doesn't carry very well. My name is Vaughn Sizemore, and I'm the Community Development Consultant for Downtown Marion, Inc. Downtown Marion, Inc. being a 501c3 organization charged with the reconstruction, restoration, and development of our downtown. And those of you that paid attention in the past few years have noticed that we've done quite a few remarkable things. It's a team effort, and the team has worked very hard. In 2019, I had the opportunity for coffee with a historic preservation consultant in New Albany. She was from Newark. We met in New Albany, had coffee. This program was explained to me, and I brought it back to our board, and we liked what we heard. She was not able to finish with us for some unfortunate circumstances, but did introduce us to a backup who has performed marvelously, and I'll do the introductions in a moment. We have to approach every opportunity to love ourselves. We need to love our buildings. We need to love the history behind them. And if we have to take action to preserve that history for posterity, and not only that, the preservation of it just creates an absolutely unique environment. So I'm going to introduce to you today Nathalie Wright, who is a historic preservation consultant. I had the privilege, not only with you, but the previous consultant, of walking every building in our downtown twice. And let me tell you, we have an extremely large downtown, don't we? And we have a great number of buildings, larger than most of the communities about which you're familiar. And I also would like to introduce Barb Powers from the Ohio History Connection, a State Historic Preservation Office. And they are going to explain this program. We have gone through our preliminary submission, and we will be in front of the committee in December, as I understand. And then the benefits of this designation will come forward. And I will allow them to explain that because they're going to do a much better job than I. So will you be first? Okay, first. Then let us welcome Barb Powers.
Okay, great. Thank you, Vaughn.
Well, thanks, Vaughn. And it's a real pleasure to be here. I have to say, I mentioned Devon and Matt and some others. I grew up in Bucyrus, Ohio. So Marion is sort of like a second home. We shopped in downtown, Sutton and Leitner's, and a couple of the other stores in downtown Marion. Went to the Palace. Actually, I have my first movie I went to with my mother was a Saturday afternoon at the Palace, The Unsinkable Molly Brown. So maybe dating me a little bit, but nevertheless. So it's exciting to be here talking to you all about the National Register of Historic Places and what it will mean for you all. And most specifically, I'll talk about the process and program and process of the National Register. As Vaughn said, I am with the State Historic Preservation Office, and we are a division of the Ohio History Connection. But our office carries out activities associated with historic preservation for the state of Ohio. We are partially funded through National Park Service funding, and most of the programs we oversee, like the National Register program, were created out of the National Historic Preservation Act. So we have counterparts of similar staffing and programs that we oversee in every state. There's a state historic preservation office. So we do all these things. We work with folks throughout Ohio to identify and survey historic properties, to nominate those properties to the National Register, to help people create preservation plans, to develop local preservation programs, and create what are called certified local governments that carry out those local preservation programs. And of course, we administer the historic tax credits program. But today, we're going to focus on the National Register of Historic Places and what that means and what that doesn't mean through nomination of this proposed historic district. The National Register of Historic Places is the official list of properties worthy of preservation because of their significance in history, architecture, culture, archaeology. And it tells people that you have something worthy of preservation. As I mentioned, the National Register was created out of the National Historic Preservation Act in 1966. And as you can see from our map, we have listings in the National Register in every county in the state. And we have over 4,000 listings. And those listings, those nominations to the National Register are comprised of over 51,000 historic properties identified throughout the state. And we're closing in on getting closer to 600 historic districts that are listed in the National Register. So, and as we'll learn this afternoon, the National Register tells property owners, tells local decision makers that you have something worthy of preservation. But as I think and hope you'll learn by the end of my presentation, the National Register is far more of a carrot than it is a stick. It provides tools for you to take advantage of if you choose to do that, to decide how to preserve the properties that you own or that you are in charge of or that are part of your community. But it really leaves that decision-making, for the most part, at that local level and in your hands, and obviously where it should be and where it is most effective. So what makes a property eligible for the National Register? There are three basic ingredients. One is age. Typically, properties are 50 years or older to qualify for the National Register, although, as we'll learn with this particular district, there are some exceptions to that rule. Significance. Properties must be significant to be listed in the National Register, and significance is judged by what we call the 4 National Register criteria. Criterion A deals with properties that reflect broad patterns of history or specific events important to our understanding of history. Criterion B is associated with properties that are associated with important people who've made important contributions to a community. C is the architectural criteria, focusing on architecture or design or significant building property types or materials or methods of construction. Criterion D are properties mostly archaeological in nature that have the ability to yield information that's important to our understanding of our history and our culture. And that significance can be judged at a national level of significance, or it can be judged at a statewide level or the local level. And by far, the majority of National Register nominations listed in Ohio, and for that matter, for the entire country, the majority of them focus on and tell an important story about the local history and significance and architectural character of a community. And the last ingredient is historic integrity. Ultimately, the National Register is really about place-based history. And therefore, in addition to telling an important story and conveying the significance of your community, the properties being nominated to the National Register have to retain essential or key physical characteristics that convey that significance, allow you to understand the time period in which they were built or the time period in which they achieved their significance. And as you'll see, talk more in depth about the proposed historic district, that doesn't mean that properties have to be frozen in time and never have changed. All properties change over time. But it's really understanding why the area that's being nominated is significant, what is its important, significant story, and then what are what we call character defining features. What are those physical characteristics expressed through location, design, setting, materials, feeling, and association that help you understand the history and the significance through the built environment. So, what can be listed in the National Register? When I talk about these listings, well, individual buildings are listed, or structures like canal remnants are listed, or bridges. Sites like the designed landscape Mill Creek Park up in Youngstown, Ohio, or objects like the Toronto World War I monument in the center of Toronto in Jefferson County, and historic districts. And that's what we're talking about tonight. This is what's been proposed, is a historic district for downtown Marion. So as you can see by the definition, historic districts are concentrations of properties that together relate to one another historically and architecturally to collectively tell that story, tell their history. And you can have, like we're talking about with the Marion downtown, commercial downtown centers listed as historic districts. You can have residential neighborhoods listed in the National Register as districts. Or you can have college campuses, the collection of college buildings that relate to one another and tell the history of that college. And you can have even entire townships. The Elizabeth Township Rural Historic District in Miami County is a collection of historic farmsteads that retain much of their historic farm buildings, as well as farm lanes, fence rows, fields, to together convey that rich agricultural history associated with that particular part of our state. So, focusing in, and this is just a quick overview to orient ourselves, and then Nathalie's going to wrap up the presentation today by telling you a little more about how the proposed district meets those three elements of significance, integrity, and age. But National Register Marion Historic District, it's being nominated under criterion A and C for its history and architectural significance, representing the commercial growth and development of Marion's downtown center, as well as expressing significant examples of commercial and government institutional architecture that together helps convey this late 19th, early 20th century commercial center county seat. The time period, what we call the period of significance, we're looking at is a range of time, 1828 to 1980. So we're talking about a long span of time that reflects some of the earliest buildings, reflecting that history and significance that remain in the town center, right up to some of the more larger imposing buildings that were built shortly thereafter the World War II and in that more recent past mid-century time period that still reflect a growth and vitality for downtown Marion. This is the purple are the boundaries for the historic district. So for a historic district nomination, everything within that boundary is part of the National Register nomination. All the properties within the boundary will be listed as part of the National Register nomination. So as you might imagine, the majority of those properties, roughly 109 of them, are what we call contributing. And that means they were built within that time period, and their history helps convey that overall commercial and history and architectural character of the district. And then there are also 5 properties that have already been listed individually. So they're part of the district, but called out because they're already listed. And then there are just a handful of properties that were built after that time period, or they were built during the time period, but have been significantly altered so that they really don't retain that historic integrity and no longer add to the understanding of the district. And they're called non-contributing. And this will all mean a little bit more as we move along here. I'm certainly willing to entertain some questions, but if anybody has a really burning question, but I think also we'll take a little break after my presentation before Nathalie's to cover some questions, but if not, we'll just keep moving. So one of the most important reasons we're here today is to tell you what the National Register means and doesn't mean to you as a property owner, as part of Marion. So basically, the National Register listing does not change your rights as a property owner, period. It doesn't, the listing in the National Register, if your property is part of the boundaries of the National Register district, the listing in the National Register is not going to require you to remodel or repair or alter or sell or even demolish the property, nor is it going to prohibit you from doing that unless you're using federal funds, and we'll talk about that shortly. Nor does it require you to make repairs to your property. One of the items that often is sometimes can be misunderstood about the National Register is often people think it's going to automatically create some type of a local design review where everything that anybody does to their property has to be reviewed by a group of individuals within the community. And that would be created through a local ordinance or local legislation, and it is not automatically created out of listing in the National Register. Sometimes communities take that next step to keep realizing that these properties are worthy of preservation, and therefore they want to take some steps to ensure preservation of resources within a district, and they will create those ordinances. But again, I want to stress that does not automatically come through National Register listing. So you might wonder, what does the National Register listing do? Well, ultimately, it is a planning tool. It's an education tool. It's designed to give you the information that you all need to make preservation decisions or help guide you in preservation decisions about the community, about the historic district, about the downtown. It also can be a very powerful education tool. The information that's prepared as part of the nomination presents very cohesive presentation of the history of the area. It links that history to architectural, stylistic trends and building types that are represented in the district. And often communities take that information and turn it into walking tours or publications or add it to information that they put on plaquing or other types of educational tools and materials. A little more tangible is the fact that properties within a historic district may qualify for federal historic preservation tax credits. And in Ohio, we have a very robust state historic preservation tax credit. And those are also properties qualify for those through National Register listing. So let me give a little more specificity about that program. But I'm not going to go into all the nitty-gritty, but income producing properties that contribute to the historic district listed in the National Register. And when we say income producing, we mean either commercial or residential rental. Those properties may qualify for a historic preservation tax credit. And the federal preservation tax credit is a 20% credit. The state tax credit is a 25% credit. And for both of these credits, you as a property owner make the decision to seek out credits. And in doing that, the work that you are doing preparing to do to the property to rehabilitate it, to put it back into use or put it into a new use, that work is reviewed by our office, the State Preservation Office, and then by the National Park Service to determine if it meets certain standards, which are called the Secretary of Interior Standards for Rehabilitation. And what these are 10 very basic, really common sense type guidance on making sure that the work that's being done to the property is sensitive to the historic character and the property retains its historic integrity. So again, there is a design review associated with historic tax credits, but you have to choose to take advantage of the historic tax credits. You as a property owner have to apply for those credits. So that's not something that just you have to do or is automatically done for you. You have to make that decision to make that application. And the state credit and the federal credit work really very well together. We partner with the Department of Development for the state tax credit. The similarities are the work is judged for either credit by that same set of guidelines and actually by the same staff in our office. So you're working with the same people regardless of what credit you're seeking out. The federal credit, anytime you choose to take that credit, you apply for the credit, you work through that process, that paperwork, project gets approved, work meets the what we call the standards, you're going to be able to file and get the credit when the work is done. It's been given a final review. The state historic preservation tax credit is a competitive process. And there are 2 rounds in the spring and in the fall in which you have to apply. And the state historic preservation tax credit also has coupled with it a economic feasibility study. And frankly, we think that's a great thing because it proves right up front that the work you're doing, the building and the repair you're going to be doing is adding back to the economic vitality and economic reinvestment of the community. So those are those are 2 fairly distinctive differences in the state and the federal credit, because then there is a competitive round aspect. So you could apply for the state tax credit and not be awarded in that round. But what we often do see is people apply again and get awarded. You know, it's just a different set. You're competing against a different set. But even if the state tax credit, you're not pursuing that, you can just keep right on going with the federal tax credit. But most people do successfully use those in combination. The last aspect of what the National Register does is properties listed in the National Register, or even those considered to qualify for the National Register, those are given special consideration if there are federally funded or projects impacting the historic district, or if there's a project that requires a federal permit, like a cell tower, requires an FCC, Federal Communications permit. So if there's a federally funded or federal permit project that is in, the first questions asked is, how is this project impacting properties listed in the National Register or that qualify or eligible for the National Register? This is a routine part, this coordination with our office, the State Preservation Office, to determine that impact. And if it's determined to be an adverse impact, like the buildings are going to be demolished, proposed for demolition, or a roadway is coming in and making a large impact on the district, then there's what we call mitigation that's worked through. But this is a routine part of planning for federally funded projects. And so often we have misunderstanding of the National Register. We often can hear local officials say, we don't want to have anything to do with that National Register because it will prohibit us from using federal funding. Well, that's not true. Certain can apply for federal funding, and in fact, National Register helps you understand. If you already know what's listed in your community and you are seeking federal funding for a project that's going to impact it, you already know that. You can plan up front to figure out how that may or may not impact, or how the use of your federal dollars needs to address the historic properties. But it is not the National Register listing that triggers that review. It's the use of the federal funds that triggers that review. So that's a very important distinction that I want to make during my presentation here. So just a little bit about process. Anyone can nominate a property to the National Register, meaning that you don't have to necessarily be the property owner to nominate the property to the National Register. But property owners are always notified before properties are actually listed in the National Register. Every National Register nomination goes through 3 levels of review. First, the nomination is materials are researched and prepared and submitted to our office. Let me just quickly tell you what a National Register nomination consists of. It's not just like an application where you check off boxes. It's actually a document, a physical document that includes narratives describing the buildings and describing the physical appearance of the historic district, talking about any alterations or changes that have taken place, explaining how the district retains historic integrity. And then there's another narrative that talks about how the district qualifies under those criteria, presents the history of the area being nominated, explains how the architecture reflects that history and what the significant examples of architecture are. Coupled with that is a map. Often coupled with that are historic images or other historic materials to help reinforce that significance that's conveyed. And then there's photographs taken that show the current condition and current appearance of the historic district. So all that material is what we call a National Register nomination. So when that's submitted to our office, myself or other members of my department, my staff, we will work with the applicant and review all that material to determine whether or not it meets those criteria and meets that integrity, those 3 ingredients that will qualify it for the National Register. So that's taken place, and now it's scheduled for that middle step, the consideration by the Ohio Historic Site Preservation Advisory Board. The State Review Board is a 17-member board. They're appointed by the governor, and they're made up of historians, architectural historians, planners, archaeologists, architects, public members from across the state. They meet 4 times a year, and their charge is to advise our office as to whether or not the properties being nominated to the National Register, guess what? Are the proper age, meet the National Register criteria, and have historic integrity. So on the meeting where this is considered, which is going to be December 3rd, the board will make their recommendation that day. They'll give us their advice on whether or not they think this nomination should proceed and be nominated, or whether or not they think it needs additional work and is tabled, or whether or not it doesn't meet those 3 ingredients and should not be nominated. And I can give you a little spoiler alert. The board does their job very, very well. And the majority of properties they consider, because our staff and the people preparing the nominations, we get them as a complete as they can be when they get to the board. So the majority of properties the board considers, they will say yes, and it moves on through the process. Never a guarantee, but just we usually have a pretty good track record. So after that board meeting, we will go through the materials one more time just to be sure everything's there. And often the board will have suggestions or some recommendations that they'd like to see incorporated into the material. So we'll respond to that. And then the nominations are signed and sent to the National Park Service. So once it's sent to the Park Service, that triggers their 45-day review period. So all in all, from the time we, by end of day on December 3rd, and these nominations don't go to the board, the Park Service like on December 4th, but they do go within a few weeks, or hopefully within a few weeks after that board meeting. You should be planning your big celebration by roughly end February, mid-March. So by the time spring is here, hopefully we'll have a historic district listed. So my last bit of information is how you all can take advantage of commenting and expressing your opinions about the proposed National Register nomination. So there are some built-in time periods and notification periods. So in the case of Marion, within 30 days prior to that board meeting on December 3rd, we sent letters to the chief elected official, your mayor, and let them know that this historic district was being proposed. Since the historic district, within that boundary, there are more than 50 property owners, we hold a public meeting, like we're holding right now, to talk to you one-on-one in person in the community. And we also are required through the National Park Service, National Register requirements, we post a legal notice in the paper, local paper, which outlines pretty much everything I'm saying right here tonight without the pictures. So we encourage property owners, elected officials, or anybody interested in commenting on the nomination to do that. Write letters of support. Anything like that is shared with the board, and they accompany the nomination packet to the National Park Service. They stay on file in our office at the State Historic Preservation Office. And property owners, private property owners, do have the ability to object to the listing of the district in the register. And there's some very specific items about this that I want to share with you in detail. So for a historic district, because what's being nominated is, as I said, everything within those boundaries. So it is a historic district nomination. So if a majority of private property owners who own property within that boundary choose to object and They voice their objection through sending notarized letters of objection. The National Register puts the responsibility on the owners that are actually objecting. The National Register is designed to assume people support the nomination. But if we would receive a majority of private property owners who have sent us letters of objection, I said we would send those with the nomination. The nomination would continue through the process that I outlined. It would go to our board. The board would make a recommendation. We would send the nomination to the National Park Service, but it would not be listed in the National Register. The Park Service would do the same that we've done. They would determine whether or not it met the criteria and whether or not it had historic integrity, and they would make the decision, and it's called determination of eligibility. Now you're probably wondering, what is she talking about and why is she making such a fuss over this? Well, a couple things I said earlier about what the National Register, the benefits associated with the National Register. If you recall, if you were listening carefully, when I talked about the tax credits, I said contributing properties located within a listed National Register district. So if the district is not actually listed, no property owner can take advantage of the historic tax credits unless their property would be one of those 5 that are individually listed or individually you sought out to nominate. So when an owner objects, we don't just take their property out. It impacts the entire district. But you recall when I was talking about the review of federally projects, I mentioned that the impact of federally funded projects on properties listed in or eligible for the National Register. The use of federal funds triggers that type of review. So regardless of whether or not the area would be actually listed, there'd still be a review take place if there's a federally funded project that takes place. Now, if for some reason there would be a majority of property owners object and the district wouldn't be listed, does that mean out of luck for all time? No. If for some reason ownership would change, if opinions would change, objections could be rescinded, or new property owners could write in that they don't object, and that could be reversed. And again, I just stress this because there are some very specific steps that do need to be taken. So if someone does feel strongly about that, they need to understand, and that's part of what my purpose in here tonight is to talk to you about what that means. But again, often people come back around and say, well, why would somebody object? And I would say that's a good question, but I truly, in all seriousness, mean there really is very little reason to object to a National Register listing, because again, I want to stress, it doesn't change your rights as a property owner. If you choose to take advantage of some of the benefits associated with the National Register, good for you, and those are there for your benefit. But if you choose not to, good for you too. No one's going to make you reuse your building. No one's going to make you keep it up. I mean, obviously there are local building codes and there are other laws that you have to abide by. The National Register doesn't rescind those either. But anyway, just so everyone, just so everyone's aware of all the parameters and all the aspects of National Register listing and the process of listing. So that big day is December 3rd. The board meeting begins at 10 a.m. And right now we are having our board meetings take place as a hybrid type of meeting. Our state review board must honor Ohio's open meeting laws. So they must meet now in person in order to have a quorum and in order to vote. but we are encouraging the public to join the meeting via Zoom. And we have the information on how you can register for the meeting via Zoom at our website. And again, I can send the link out live to you all, and I think it may be already been in some of your materials, but we can make sure everybody gets that out because we do want you to attend and participate in the meeting. As a Zoom member, you'll see the entire board and you'll hear the entire board, and the board will interact with you all. The board will always ask for public comment for every nomination. So anybody that wants to make a public comment or make a statement, they'll be able to do that via Zoom, and the board will hear you. Sometimes the board has questions for the author of the nomination or for other representatives of the community that might be in the audience, and they can ask those questions. Those questions can be answered. But so that's how we've been setting those up. If you want to send your letters of support or otherwise send correspondence to, actually to Bert Logan. He's the State Historic Preservation Officer. He's also the director of the Ohio History Connection. And that's our mailing address. And you can send those by mail, or you can send the letter and send it to an attachment. You can send it to me. You can address it to me. I mean, you know, just as long as you get it to the Ohio History Connection in order to make it received by our within our organization. And your correspondence should arrive or be received before the on or by that board meeting. However, if any information, any additional correspondence comes before the time we've sent it to the National Park Service, it will still go with it to the National Park Service as part of the National Register nomination. So, pause for some questions right now, and I want to reinforce that I brought handouts with me. I brought just a basic fact sheet about the National Register. Again, it pretty much covers everything I've said this evening or this afternoon. I brought a fact sheet that outlines that review process that I talked about, and I brought information about rights of property owners. So it outlines that process for commenting on National Register nominations. So, questions? Can't imagine you don't have some. Yes, sir.
First of all, I don't imagine there'll be a mass number of rejections.
Like
that being said, being a numbers guy, so one person owns 7 parcels, one person owns 1 parcel. One with this. How's that majority figured out?
That's a very good question. It is majority rule, so it's 1 vote, so to speak, per property owner, regardless of how many properties you own. So the person that owns 6 buildings has the same ability to convey their opinion about the listing as the person that owns 1 building. And husbands and wives, or if you own a property that you have your spouse is on the deed with you, or some other business partner is on a deed with you. If there's 2 of you, you basically split the difference if one of them is objecting and one does not, because it's not majority. LLCs or corporations like that, it is how they are listed on the deed. So if it is just like Popcorn Incorporated LLC listed on the deed, there's 1 entity that speaks for that. If every person's name or trustee is listed, then each of them have a say. But hopefully we just are overwhelmed by letters of support for those entities and those kind of things. But good question. Any other questions? Yes.
I went into two questions. When letters of support are written, Should those be notarized also?
No.
Just the letter section.
Right, and again, that's just like I said, the way the program's shaped, it puts the responsibility of proving you're the owner on the people who are objecting to the listing. It assumes support.
Okay.
So letters of support, they don't have to be.
Very good. And then the other thing I wanted to ask, on December 3rd, at 10 a.m. before the State Review Board, is it beneficial to have, I know it's going to be Zoom, but does the board look at the number of people participating in Marion, Ohio, as if you have 20 people in the audience versus having one person in the audience?
Well, ultimately the board will, as I said, review each nomination, including Marion Downtown District, based on whether it meets the criteria or has integrity. But it is encouraging for the board to know, and Zoom, it's a little tricky because they won't actually see everybody, but you certainly could, express in your public comments that we have a whole room full of people here to watch this. And I think it shows the board and conveys to the board that the town is excited and is, appreciative and is seeking this out. And it does send a message. It's not going to necessarily sway their opinion, but it does tell them, and it's encouraging. So yes, if you all, like a group of people, it's like watching a World Series or something. It's gripping video, let me tell you.
Thinking back on the letters of support, what is this officially called, this district? Downtown Marion Historic, like what?
It's Marion Downtown Historic District.
Marion, that's what we should use when we're doing the letters of support. Marion Downtown Historic District. Thank you.
Yes, sir. I know you have a question too.
Okay,
let me go first.
Go ahead. Your handout on the nomination process lists certified local governments, and I see Marion is not listed. Is there something that we have to do to get on that list?
Yes. A certified local government, that catchy title, is a designation that communities can apply to our organization, State Historic Preservation Organization, to be considered a certified local government. And what it means is that community has created a local historic preservation program. They've created a local ordinance that initiates design review, and they have the ability to designate locally historic landmarks, historic properties. And they've created a government, they've created a local preservation program. And often communities then create preservation plans to help direct decision-making at that local level. And becoming a certified local government, having that designation through our office, means that the community can apply for certified local government grants. A portion of our federal funding we receive in our office, we re-grant out to those communities each year for historic preservation projects. Some of them can be bricks and mortar type projects. They can be creating a preservation plan or creating design guidelines or even doing historic survey or nominating properties to the National Register. The other benefit is that third parties can, like the Marion County Historical Society, could apply for a grant through this program. They just have to partner with the city to help administer it. But it's really communities taking charge of preservation within their community, shaping a local program.
So who begins that process?
The city or the community.
The government? City government?
Well, interested people like the Chamber of Commerce or the local historical society could approach the city and say, we want to look into this. Let's talk to the state preservation office. And we can send out information about the steps involved in that.
I think so.
Because it's a it's really, you know, there's responsibility in the program you design locally to carry that out, but there's again benefits if you choose to take advantage of it with particular funding, which we all know. Preservation, historic properties always are in need of funding to help. Yes. Sorry.
The city zoning code does have a design
Okay.
already in it, and a volunteer board as the design review board. If the city applied to become a certified local government, with those same, let's say that ordinance, we would need to do above and beyond.
Hard to say. It just would depend on what the parameters of your ordinance are. It may be that you're, you know, halfway there. It may be that you already have a lot of that put in place, and it's just a matter of.
And then the next question is, then does it have to, you know, for instance, our current district includes a lot, but not exactly the same boundaries. Does it always have to follow the boundaries?
And that's a very good question. Local communities and local ordinances, they often have, because they have that local design review, where they do provide guidance and render opinions on what changes are being done to properties within a district, within their district. They often have good reason for drawing boundaries that sometimes may take in vacant land because they want to have some input in what goes in there. So that's, you know, again, that's driven by the desires, the needs, the parameters of your local community. The National Register really, as the definition for a district, hones in and focuses in on that most cohesive concentration of historic properties. So the National Register district boundaries don't include, you know, like land, you know, vacant land on the edges or something of that nature, because it's not weighing in on the changes that are made to those buildings. So it's really focusing in on that historic character and that historic concentration. Yes.
This is sort of that, in addition to what Evelyn was saying, for that proposed district that's being proposed now, how firm or how fluid is that as far as being in the public comment section? If we review that and say, well, we need to add this and so forth, how does that affect the meeting on December 3rd, for example?
Well, if we got a lot of people saying they wanted to add something to the existing district, and it turned out there was some valid reason for that, well, I have to say we have never really had a lot of those kind of comments at this point.
I looked at the map yet.
Right. We would have to look at it. If it was really a valid, legitimate, you know, challenge or comment about the district boundaries, we could do a number of things. I mean, we could present those comments, and this is probably what we would do, is we would send the nomination to the board as is. Because in fact, the board gets the nomination 3 weeks prior to the meeting, because they read the nominations. As I said, they take their job seriously. So if we were to receive comments and say, well, we think the boundaries should be different, those would just go to the board. And frankly, it would be a question perhaps raised to the board. Does the boundaries make sense? We've had comments. So it'd be the board advising us that, well, you know, we think the boundaries should be changed too, and that might cause them to table the nomination, and then it would have to go back and get adjusted. Or the board might say, no, we think the boundaries are fine. There's other buildings that we can individually be listed or something like that. But right now, this nomination is sort of in that chute. So it is going to go to the board as it has been prepared, because it's already been through review by our office. So if there are comments or other things to the boundaries, those can be raised. And again, if if they're, you know, identifying maybe properties that are individually qualify on their own and just don't quite fit into the district, we could, you know, help pursue and encourage how those might be pursued too. But it will go kind of as presented now, and any questions and things of that nature will be sorted out by the board and or by our office following the board meeting. Yes, Paul.
Just a quick add. In the vetting process, there's a great deal of research that goes in every one of these buildings. And as we walk through, look at the candidates, there are considerations that have to be done. You saw the right standards. Then subsequent to that, there has to be continuity in order to make a district. So for example, if you find a building that applies and it looks great, but it is separated by 600 feet from the rest of the district, and nothing in between qualifies, then that's not continuity. The idea is to keep a concentrated district. So that's another variable that came into this analysis. And the background research, I'm going to give you another problem. Okay? The background research, I think, spent hours in the library coming up with architectural styles, why the buildings were built, responsible for building them, how they've been used over time. And so all this criteria came in based on their experience with what became a qualified submission. And so you may find a building that you think belongs, but it may meet the criteria. But if it's not adjacent to the district, if it's a block away or 2 blocks away, then it's not going to make the district. Okay, so you might think about this and do a little map.
And a good way of talking about, and we also, our staff always makes a site visit prior to the preparation of the nomination, just to visit in person the boundaries. But when you look at National Register boundaries, and Nathalie's presentation will illustrate this as well. It's really, I love Venn diagrams and positions that are out there, but it really is a Venn diagram. I mean, you're looking at what is the historic parameters of that community during that time period, and then what you kind of layer on top of that, what has changed. And there's some things that have changed maybe during the period that the area is being called the period of significance. So those are factored in. And then there's more modern day changes or other things that have impacted the district. So it's really the final boundaries are kind of the strongest concentration of all those layers of history and change that have taken place and sort of where they all collide. And that Venn diagram is what becomes your boundary, your defensible boundary. Yes, sir.
I'm going to go out on a limb and just assume that this district goes through with all the work that's been done and all the factors. So I know that beyond that, some of the implications, some of the tax credits and so forth could get complicated. I don't want to, take a long time discussing, all the intricacies of the program. But can you give an idea, just if there are qualifying projects within the district, what is the best case time frame that we might be able to consider for those projects? So in other words, if this is all approved in spring, then you said that the projects have to go to the development officer, your officer, whomever, and be reviewed in the spring and the fall. Would it be able to get in the spring still? And how long is that review process? Right. What's kind of our best case scenario for a project if it were to qualify for the program? Okay,
well, here I go. And there's 2 answers. So you mentioned the state tax credit, so let me talk about it first. The round in spring, the deadline for applying is March 31st. So the property has to be listed individually or be contributing to a listed historic district by March 31st. So my responsibility as a staff member and overseeing the National Register is that when if the board says yes to the nomination, our charge then following that December 3rd meeting is to ensure that this nomination gets finalized, packaged up, sent to the Park Service in time for it to get listed prior to that March 31st deadline. Because we know that there may be people interested in taking advantage of that. So 45 days, and the beauty of that now is we send the nominations to the Park Service electronically. So actually, the miracle of technology, I push the button and send the nomination. Within later that same day, I get an acknowledgement from the Park Service that the 45 days starts ticking. So, and our goal, and again, I have to qualify it between, you know, the board often can bring up questions or have suggestions, and our goal is your goal. We want this area listed. We want successful National Register nominations. So we are very cautious and careful about making sure when we send that nomination to Washington that it's all complete, ready to go, and it will be successfully listed. Our reviewer in Washington sometimes can raise questions, and we try to minimize that. Because again, the whole idea is it's gone through rigorous preparation, it's gone through review by our staff, the board's gone through. After the board meeting, things should just click along. There is a little time to get it packaged up and final, and then out the door. But our goal always for anything that's on the September board meeting or the December board meeting is that it gets listed in time for an applicant to make that application for that state tax credit. Now, the state tax credit has its own set of very tight, very detailed time frames. So if you're at all interested in the state historic preservation tax credit, I would look at our website, ohiohistory.org, and go to the state historic preservation section and look under historic tax credits to be able to see that the details associated with it, or go to the Department of Development's website and look up the historic preservation tax credits. Because there are deadlines and timeframes and meetings that are required for application to the tax credits. So that's the state tax credit. And it does a great job of outlining all those steps and that process. For the federal tax credit, you had a property you wanted to apply for the federal tax credit, you can send your application in tomorrow. Because the federal program understands, and I say that like the state tax credit doesn't, but that isn't that, I don't mean that. State tax credit is put together under the parameters that worked best and was agreed upon. But the federal credit, the federal process acknowledges that there is a time frame in nominating properties to the National Register. So for sake of illustration, this gentleman here has a property and he's interested in taking the tax credits, the federal tax credits. So he fills out his paperwork, which there's two parts to it. There's a part one that talks about, it establishes whether or not you have a property that is contributing to this historic district. And then the second part talks about the work you're going to do. So you actually could fill out that part one and explain how your property is identified in this nomination. And we could send that paperwork to the National Park Service with a copy of the existing, the nomination that's in the works. And the program allows them to give you a preliminary determination that it's going to eventually get listed. Now, you would do your work and you have to do a final paperwork to show you did your work before you get the credit. You can't file with the tax people in the IRS until you actually can also show that the area has been listed. But I say that in planning. Sometimes based on people's financial circumstances and other those types of non-historic type of factors, you may want to get started on a historic tax credit application. So the federal program is just ongoing. You can apply it any time. It's not driven by these rounds that are associated with the state. But if you want to take advantage of both credits, combine 45% credit, you do have to think through and be aware and try to coordinate the two programs. So I'm sure I've said a lot more now. And you might say, well, now wait a minute, based on what you said, what's it matter if we have to get it listed? No. The district has to get listed in order for anybody to file that credit and receive that credit. So yes.
To add on to it.
Oh, good. I confuse you even more.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Given that the national is, as you said, kind of an open cycle, so let's say he's turned in his part one and determines his, his eligible, and then he can do the work after that one, correct? With the state tax credit, you can't begin your work, or that was one thing.
Yes, and
until
that's
after you've been awarded. So
yes, and that's why I say if you want to take advantage of both programs, you really need to coordinate those. Because, again, the state tax credit is looking at, do you need this credit in order to make this project happen? So if you've got the building done, they're going to say, it's not it. So yes, so the state tax credit also has that requirement that you can't start the work. So again, you have to coordinate if you want to take advantage of both credits. And that's why we have staff members in our office, and Lisa Brownell is the staff person at the Department of Development, and the technical preservation services staff in our office that work with me. That's all they do is work with tax credit projects, both state and federal. And that's all Lisa Brownell does is work with the state tax credit. So they are very knowledgeable to be able to, if you're at all interested, you can't stress enough, you should contact them right away and start talking through the process and start talking through what's going to work with your project and your time. But my role is to get this district listed. So that's where I come in, and that's where we work through this also somewhat lengthy process to make sure this happens and make sure it does get it set up as soon as it possibly can for taking advantage of the benefits. So we need to have Nathalie talk to you about the specific district, but great questions, And you ready? Any other questions, or we want to get to now? Thank you. And we have time for more after that, but why don't we work from Nathalie's, because she may have answers.
Nathalie, are you going to be talking more about what Barbara was mentioning about the process of the project specifically?
Yeah.
Is that your portion?
Putting some cards on.
Okay, well, here's the map again. And so this is the proposed Marion Downtown Historic District, which again contains commercial, institutional, and a few residential buildings. And Barb had already outlined that we've identified, or I identified 109 contributing buildings, 5 non-contributing, 2 non-contributing sites, which are, can't see it very well, the park, this park, and there's a little pocket park up here. Those are the 2 sites. They're too young, too new, not quite, it's not really a design landscape so much, so they're non-contributing. And then there are 5 buildings already listed in the National Register. So to go back to the process that came up in sort of the Q&A, And Vaughn had mentioned there was a previous preservation consultant that you all had started to work with, and she did the preliminary National Register questionnaire and submitted it with a draft map or proposed district boundary. So when I came on board in December, there was a mild day in December. I didn't even have a contract yet. I had Vaughn's promise that I would have a contract, but I wanted to take advantage of the weather. So I came up and I had the map that Liz had done previously. And I walked the whole area, took photographs. And when I start the process, I always go big. I want to include everything. And so I had really stretched it out further west and picked up some stuff down here a little more. And then in the research process, I tightened it back up to what made sense for this particular district, again, to be cohesive and to have the most intact collection of properties with the best historic integrity. So the boundary that I ended up with is a little bit different than what was initially proposed, but basically the same. It's not too different. And then after that, in January, again, taking advantage quickly on a mild day, Susie Teets, who was a former staff member, just retired from the preservation office, she met here and we walked around with Vaughn on a chilly but kind of mild afternoon. And so we walked all of this again, and through her guidance, we settled on, okay, these are the best, most defensible district boundaries. Because again, the Park Service, the State Review Board, OSHBAB will look at it, and the Park Service, and they will weigh in on the boundaries. So when I take on a project, I always think, well, can I defend this in front of the State Review Board? If I don't feel like I can defend it, then I don't want to take on the project. So that's my internal thinking. There is a cluster of buildings to the west that initially I thought about including, but visually the district does kind of drop off here. And Vaughn had mentioned that idea of what's cohesive, what's coherent. And so when we did the walk with Susie in January, it just felt like visually this was a good stopping point. And that's why we stopped here. Also to the north, especially on Main Street, as you go past the courthouse, there's a nice cluster of historic commercial buildings up here. And I had initially had the thought of, oh, maybe we go up here. But what happens is you have that alley back here and railroad tracks and the overpasses. And again, visually, it made sense to stop the district here. Now in the future, you might come back and look at this as a small cluster of buildings that maybe have their own significance, maybe their own era of development or history that's slightly different than the core downtown. Same with this western end. There was a nice church building, I think here, that I really liked and kind of wanted to swoop over and include. But again, visually, this Vine Street's a busy street. It just creates a cutoff, and it became too cumbersome to kind of pick up some strays at the edges. And that's kind of the thinking on how I approached it, and then how it was confirmed through a staff visit. And then I came up here again to do research, and I drove and walked the district again and retook photographs. I have a few more to retake today. So anyway, that's the district and where we were. So what I'm going to talk about is just kind of a quick overview of the information that's in the nomination and provide a kind of a background on the history that I uncovered and talk a little bit about architectural style that is present within the district in Marion. And then after that, if we have more questions, we'll go from there. So anyway, this is the original 1922 plat that you can see here. And so the district, again, is kind of centered in Maine, your two primary streets that have always been your primary streets. North Street essentially is where the railroad tracks are. Again, that idea of the visual boundary. And south is Church, and This is State now and Prospect. So Marion was platted in 1822, and it was immediately designated the county seat in anticipation of Marion County's formation, which occurred 2 years later in 1824. Roughly aligning with today's Main Street, the settlement or the plat centered around a military road that was created through the forest during the War of 1812. So this part of north central and sort of northwestern Ohio largely was not very settled until after the War of 1812. And there are other communities kind of in the region, especially kind of north of Mansfield, north of here, where you find that they were settled after the War of 1812. And so there was this military road that General Harrison, William Wright Harrison used to bring troops through the forest and make their way up to the Toledo area for war efforts and maneuvers, and battles, and so forth. So unlike other communities, Marion wasn't platted or situated near a body of water. It was really about that road, that transportation piece, early transportation. Whoops, sorry, let me go ahead. Increasing 130% in the 1840s, Marion had its largest ever jump in population to this day. So I always like those kind of statistics, and they're important, and they support what you're saying is significant in the nomination. So that jump in population resulted in Marion being incorporated as a village in 1947. In the 1880s, there was another significant jump in population, not quite as large as that 130%, but that again caused the village to then become designated as a city. So the Marion Downtown Historic District is being nominated for association with local commerce. And the National Register nomination divides Marion's overall history into 3 main eras. And the first one is early settlement in the stagecoach era from 1822 to 1850. So here are 3 examples from the era. This, of course, whoops, I'm sorry, I keep pushing the wrong button. There we go. So this I saw reference to as being called the Old Stone Block. It was constructed circa 1828. It's the oldest building in the historic district, and it is what starts the period of significance that Barb mentioned. The period of significance almost always starts with the oldest building or the oldest piece of construction in or at the property, whatever property type it might be. In the early 1840s, the building functioned as the Marion Academy, the first private academy in the village. This house, probably most of you are familiar with it. It's a really, really lovely Gothic revival house. It was built by Dr. Henry A. True in 1848. Again, another pretty old property in the downtown. Dr. True arrived in Marion in 1839. He practiced medicine for the next decade. And then he left the medical field in 1849, and he ran the Reed and Company dry goods business for 7 years. And then he was also prolific or prominent in the banking trade, the local banking trade, for another 20 years. His name comes up a lot in activities or businesses from the mid-1800s. And then here is a really nice L-shaped frame house constructed circa 1850. A couple doors down from this house. It's a nice little block on East Church there. It was reportedly constructed by Dr. True for his colleague, R.H. Johnson. And Johnson had arrived in Marion in 1842 from New York City. Dr. True was also from the New England area. And Johnson worked with True in the dry goods store. So what was interesting about this place is pretty early on, by the late 1800s, it had a commercial application. It was being used as furniture repair or for upholstery work. And so even at that point, and I'll have another example here in a moment, you start to see some of the housing have commercial usage. And already by the late 1800s, a shift from residential properties that surrounded the core downtown commercial intersections to slowly having the residences in that area also become commercial. So we'll talk now a little bit about the second period of development, the railroad and industrial area from 1851 to 1929. This era brought the greatest growth and prosperity to the village, and it included important businesses such as the Huber Manufacturing and Marion Steam Shovel Companies. The railroad came in 1851, thus beginning this period of development. And so then the arrival of the railroad then in turn spurred industrial development. And so that in turn gives you the growth of the downtown with all kinds of commercial properties to then support the industrial businesses and the workers that came to work in those industries and so forth. So it's sort of the cyclical thing that keeps the growth kind of moving out from main and center. So the bulk of the buildings in the historic district date to this era of development. And I just put a few examples here. So we'll start with this house here on East Center. That's the Fribley House. It was built for a local merchant who had a dry goods business. And like I mentioned with that small frame house, it started to have commercial applications in the 19-teens. It was a maternity hospital during that time period. And then by 1920, it was a facility for x-rays. And so it had medical applications for a number of years before it became something else. Now it's apartments, but again, on the edge of the downtown, you start seeing nice old houses like this become commercial. This in the middle is the Marion County Bank. It was built to be the bank building in 1870. The Marion County Bank remained there until 1908. This is the Huber building, completed in 1903. It was commissioned by industrialist Edward Huber. It's an early kind of skyscraper for Marion, had 54,000 square feet, 5 stories. It featured elevators and a rooftop garden. That'd be pretty cool. Someone brought that back. And it housed the, is it Euler Phillips department store for 60 years. So, I mean, again, that's a very prominent corner, prominent anchor in the downtown, and both historically for what it was as a commercial enterprise and also architecturally. Then what we start seeing happen in the early 20th century is transportation improvements, which then bring us different building types. So here we have this building, and then again, this is sort of our western edge of the boundary on Center Street. That is the Columbus, Delaware and Marion Traction Company building. The Traction Company completed its interurban line in 1903, and during its peak years, there were 65 daily round trips from Marion and Columbus. And this is the passenger depot. So the historic maps identify the passenger area in the front, and then on the eastern side was the freight area. And then if we kind of tie it back to this building, also 1903, the interurban is coming in 1903, which starts to tell us what was happening in the downtown during those very early years of the 1900s with this substantial building, new transportation. And then we start to envision, you know, what a vibrant downtown it was with this new form of transportation. And then we understand that, and then it's looking at the other physical evidence of what's around and how else do the other buildings in the streetscape tie into those themes of history. These two buildings, again, related to transportation. So now we have the automobile, and as early as the 19-teens on historic mapping, we start seeing a proliferation of automobile-related buildings in the core downtown area, 19-teens, particularly parking garages, which we don't think would have existed at that time period, but they did, and gas stations were all in the downtown. So this one is the Haberman Chevrolet Company building. It had a 100-car garage included in the back of the building. And right beside it, this one is the McDaniel Motor Company building. It also had a 100-car garage in the back and an auto sales portion in the storefront. And these, although they look like typical commercial buildings from that era, they were a little bit different because automobile dealerships were a new kind of business. So they included the big storefronts with the big windows so you could see the car. They often had a repair garage included in the building and lots of parking, as we see here with these two buildings. But there were automobile related buildings all over downtown Marion, more than I expected actually. So that was kind of fun and interesting to see. Also thinking about Marion as a center for the county and the surrounding region. There are entertainment facilities. Obviously the Palace Theater across the street. There's a bowling alley on South Prospect, still there from circa 1920. This building had a bowling alley in it from about 1945, the Palace Recreation Bowling Alley on the second story, and it was there into the 1960s. So looking at entertainment also as commerce is another piece of the puzzle for a downtown such as Marion's. And then of course, I know you all know this building, but the Sawyer Sanatorium. I love this building. It's just so unusual and just not something you would typically see in a county seat downtown. It's fantastic, but it is an unusual piece and an important piece of Marion's commercial history. Founded by Dr. Charles E. Sawyer, the facility was designed to treat chronic diseases and deformities. Patients, those are not my words, those are the historic terminologies. I guess we would say it differently today. But patients came from all over the US to receive treatments there, such as Swedish movement cure, faradic electricity, and scientific examinations. That's how it was phrased in the paper. And then it was so popular that Sawyer built a larger facility outside the downtown in 1910, and then this building became apartments, which it remains today. Now, of course, we're in Marion, and so during this era of development, no history would be complete without mentioning President Warren G. Harding. A state politician and owner-editor of the Marion Star, Harding was elected in 1920 to serve as the 29th President of the United States. His popular front porch campaign drew national attention to Marion. And within the historic district, there are at least 4 buildings associated with Harding. I would not be surprised if one of you pointed out one that I have missed. But we'll start here with the Trinity Baptist Church. Harding was an active member and 25-year trustee. Here is the Elks Club on South State. And circa 1910, the Elks purchased the old Grand Opera House, and in 1914 added this. This is actually an addition to the old Opera House building. Was it $100,000 new temple? But Harding was member number 67 in the Benevolent and Protective Order of Elks, Marion Chapter 32, which had been organized in 1885. So in addition to its significance as a recreational building and fraternal organization, of course, it has that tie to Harding. And then the Marion County Bank that I mentioned in the previous slide that had built that little building in 1870. The bank relocated to the Bennett Block in 1908. And during the time that the bank was located in this building, Harding served on its board of directors, including while he was president. And then, of course, I think we all recognize this building since we're in it. It was not complete until after Harding's death. The Hotel Harding is directly related to his presence in Marion. Believing that current hotel accommodations were inadequate in the city, the hotel was commissioned by city leaders to house the many high-profile visitors arriving in Marion to see Harding. the building. This is an example of one of the properties that was already listed in the National Register of Historic Places. It was listed in 1980, in part due to its connection with Harding. And then to go back to the previous slide, and Dr. Sawyer, he was also good friends with the Hardings, Dr. Sawyer and his wife, and Sawyer even traveled to DC to be Harding's official personal physician while he was president. So we'll move on now to the third identified period of development, which was the Great Depression and post-World War II era, 1930 to 1980. And there are a variety of commercial and institutional buildings constructed during this era. But what I want to talk about a little bit is how that impacted the streetscape and what was happening. So we have this little building here, which is the Marion Rural Electric Co-op. And then over here, a little bit later, but the Ohio Fuel Gas Company from 1963. There are two examples of small-scale post-World War II commercial buildings. And then this one is from 1979. It's a little larger, the phone building. It housed office and phone equipment. But all three buildings, all three of these different types of commercial buildings replaced houses that were on the respective lots, which again represents the continued development of commercial uses, both physically and in terms of product, the continued development of commercial uses in the downtown. And additionally, this one, the co-op building, had parking associated with it. So again, when we think about a historic downtown, buildings did not traditionally have parking, but that starts to show us the influence of suburban development in a historic downtown. Also, this phone building is kind of brutalist style, and all of them are still built out to the sidewalk, but its style and this building here, sort of international style, both more modern, and again, that starts to give us an influence of suburban patterns within a historic downtown, and the incorporation of the most current and up-to-date architectural trends. And another big theme, particularly in Marion, in the post-World War II era, was the construction of wings or additions of downtown churches to support growing educational, fellowship, and community functions. The majority of the churches in the district have a wing that was added in the 1950s or 60s, such as this one, with its 1966 wing on the back of what was originally the first German Methodist Episcopal Church. I think there are 8 churches in the district and 6 of them had an educational wing added. So that, again, is just a very brief overview of the themes that were identified in the nomination for Marion. So now I'll talk a little bit, just a quick overview of some of the architectural trends. So the district is being nominated under Criterion C for architectural significance. And the styles found within the district include Gothic Revival, Italianate, Second Renaissance Revival, Richardsonian Romanesque, Neoclassical Revival, Late Gothic Revival, and styles that fall under the umbrella of modern movements. I didn't include all those, but some of the ones that we see most often. And over here, over here, we'll start with the Gothic Revival. There are 4 Gothic Revival buildings within the district. We already looked at the Dr. True House. The style was popular circa 1835 to 1870. And the most common characteristics of the style are the steeply pitched roofs, on houses or residential buildings, this kind of barge board decoration that you see in the gable ends. Gables centered on the facade, the True House has that, or a cross-gabled roof configuration, the True House has that as well. Heavy, often stone lintels over the windows, and an overall sense of verticality. And you get that with the houses and with the church. And then for churches, for the Gothic Revival, you'll see towers to re-emphasize that verticality and narrow lancet windows. often with stained glass. And I really love these two houses. They're on South High. But what they speak to is they're from the mid-1800s. They're both built, I think one of them was 1848 and the other was circa 1850. But they give us a hint of what the street would have looked like in 1850 or 1860 even. And you see how close together they are, the scale of them, and what a row of them might have looked like. And to have houses like this in a downtown of this size still standing, it's really pretty unusual in my experience. I think it's really great that you have them. Now we'll move on and talk about the Italianate style down here. There's some representatives. It was very popular from circa 1850 to 1880. Many of the present buildings in the downtown center and within the historic district were constructed during the height of the Italianate style's popularity. So we see a lot of them in the historic district and really a lot of it in Ohio in general. But the key features are, again, an emphasis on height, a low-pitched roof, frieze windows, which are windows usually hiding up here underneath the eave, and deep eaves are another feature, bracketed cornices, heavy hood molds over the windows, and then round arched or segmentally, what we call segmentally arched windows are all key features of the style. Once you know those features, it's a pretty easily recognizable style. And this is the 1870s Masonic temple. And then this, of course, is just a nice row on Center Street. Up here, the courthouse, of course, it's second Renaissance revival in style, that which was seen in Ohio from circa 1890 to 1925. And it was mostly used for large, imposing governmental buildings and sometimes for commercial buildings. Prominent examples in the district, in addition to the courthouse, are the Huber building that we already looked at, the early skyscraper. Again, it's imposing. It was meant to be imposing. So it utilized the style. And then the Masons moved from this building to a new Masonic temple on South Main in 1903. That is also second Renaissance revival. So key features include rectangular massing, facade symmetry, which we can see here. If you folded the building in half, it would all line. Smooth cut wall surfaces of brick or stone or terracotta are typical of the style, and emphasized or rusticated lower floor level, which we can kind of see here, but definitely we see that on that later Masonic temple and the Huber building. Corner coins, flat roofs with balustrades. And overall, unlike these styles over here, which are more emphasized with the verticality, this style tends to have more of a horizontal reading to it. And then classically inspired detail, which we see here, especially in this pediment and this sort of temple front, which kind of harkens back to Greek and or Roman architecture. Down here, we'll look at this late Gothic revival church building. That style was popular from the 1890s to about 1930. That represented a return to a more restrained or authentically based interpretation of the style. So the Gothic revival had waves of popularity in the 1800s. So we have this early version, and then there was the high Victorian Gothic, which there aren't any in your district, but it tended to be a lot more ornate, a lot more fussy. And then after that Victorian era, the style kind of calmed down again and became a little more restrained. This is the 1918 Emmanuel Lutheran Church, and the style is most commonly seen on churches and often, especially in this era, like on collegiate buildings. Key design features are the pointed windows, typically stained glass, stone mullions, smooth or stone or brick walls with stone trim, which this building exhibits a lot of, finials or buttresses, which are these support pieces here. So this building has all those key features. And then we'll finish a little bit talking about post-World War II era and architectural expressions when they became more modern, relying less on historic precedent. In downtown Marion, this is seen through all those church additions that I mentioned from the 1950s and 60s. They're all modernist, some large bank buildings, of course, the city hall, and then a few of the small commercial buildings like we already looked at, as well as additions. There were a few houses in the district that have 1950s additions on the front, and they also tend to have a modernist flavor. So over on the left is the YMCA building from 1952. It is an example of the international style, which was popular from the 1920s to the 1950s. Key features include a flat roof, often a cubist configuration or an asymmetrical facade, although here we do see an expression of symmetry. Another feature is sort of an overall smooth wall treatment and a sense of horizontality, and that is often seen through rows or what we would call ribbon windows. So this building, again, is that more modern style with those key features. Now we'll talk about the City Hall. I identified it as brutalism. It maybe has a little bit more general modernist features than a strict interpretation of brutalism, which was popular roughly mid-1960s to the mid-1970s. City Hall was built in 1976 and completed in 77. But what it does have for the brutalist style is sort of this overhanging cantilever of the upper stories, an asymmetrical arrangement, a heavy boxy configuration. These buildings always look kind of heavy. Sometimes they look a little sculptural. Always they have a flat roof. The windows, there's usually what we call a play of void and solid, and this building has that to some degree in the lower levels where the windows are kind of concentrated in this area, and then there are no windows on the upper floors. So again, that's another feature, minimal usage of window openings, which also gives the building a heavy appearance, typical of the brutalist style. But one thing I really appreciate about the building is its placement on the site. It's got integrated planters. It's got this plaza. It's elevated above the sidewalk level. So it really has a monumental quality, and you see that in governmental buildings of the era. And I think that is a nice feature on the streetscape. And then when you look at it in comparison to what's around it, you get this sort of tapestry of architectural styles that happened throughout the 20th century. And then you're able to kind of read what was happening in that community. The period of significance ends in 1980 with one of the bank buildings on East Center. There was another building in the 1970s, late 70s, and then the City Hall kind of cumulatively put me to that point because that represents sort of the last big push of new construction in the downtown. There is one bank building on a corner that was not included because it was built a little further into the 1980s. And we have to, the other thing, in addition to defending the boundaries, we have to defend the period of significance. So the beginning is easy, it's the oldest building. The end is hard. So there are two strategies. One is that you go with the 50-year cutoff, which would be 1972. But because we have these other things happening just shortly after 1972, which would be the 50-year cutoff. What I'm trying to do is make the case these buildings make sense for Marion. They complete the story of the downtown and its core development. And therefore, the period of significance should go a little bit further. So I'll just conclude here with some nice photos. And again, this is a nice block of Italianate style buildings on South Main, and their expression of the Italianate is a little bit different than the ones on East Center that we looked at a couple minutes ago, but just a really nice cluster of buildings. Here's a nice commercial style / neoclassical revival building from about 1927. It's a bank building. Nice row here, view of the county course. And then this is another nice grouping of buildings. So lots of nice groupings of buildings. And cumulatively, what they represent within the Marion Downtown Historic District is a portrait of a 19th century village, an agricultural community center, a county seat, and an early 20th century industrial city. The district represents the city's eras of development and historic themes, as well as 19th and 20th century architectural styles. And that's all I've got, so thank you.
Any additional, thank you, Nathalie.
You're welcome.
Great summary of the nomination. And I think it illustrates perfectly how the nominations weave in that history and significance and architectural character to equate to historic integrity. So any questions, further or final?
First comment. It looks like you put a huge amount of effort into this, and thank you so much for spending all that time researching that. Now, would you say that there's pretty much maybe some sort of write-up for almost every property that you have worked on?
Yeah.
So with that, I almost feel like that in itself could be very beneficial for our community in some sort of cataloging, and maybe something that hasn't been done before, or just a way we could tap into this description in some sort of
Ohio historic inventories forms. This guy's done.
But then to put that and surface that to the general public in some way, either on the building itself or on a website or some sort of like tour through the community. And I just feel like that alone has a lot of value. I'd love to leverage that somehow, but that's really cool.
This is a small commercial along this point that while we have not completely squared accounts yet because we're poor, Downtown Marion Inc. is the funder of this project. As a small commercial, I think the board members back here, please probably hear that statement. But we also were given assistance to get a grant to help offset a great portion of this. But this is one of the value propositions that we are driving for our downtown and the downtown Marion organization. So that's the commercial, all right. And I think that we've been doing, we haven't been advertised very much, but it's a lot of work and certainly a monumental effort.
Thank you.
And I would just like to add that Ron Sizemore is the catalyst behind this, and we truly appreciate him for his job with bone attitude and bringing us to the point today. It's very, very beneficial.
And it's his birthday. Never mind, scratch that.
Birthday. Well, again, any questions? Now's your opportunity. Any questions from the Zoom people?
Not really, except for a comment that says that Marion Voices would be happy to write a letter of support for the downtown and district nomination as well. I would have a question that gets back to the projects and submission process in terms of, you mentioned a person's name that they would get in contact with, but where, I guess, does that information live once we are established, or where will we send people? Is this going to live on Downtown Marion Inc.'s like websites as a regional planning, a toolbox of like where would this fall?
Any and all. I mean,
Make arrangements to have that be on our website so we can direct people to that. And
Just so that
might be shared with chamber as well, you know.
Yeah, because obviously not every property owner here in downtown is here today. This is the first mention you get in contact with, or just how do we make sure future, I guess, when a building is sold or something like that, they are aware of all. I'm sure everyone will do a fantastic job of providing that information too. I just want to know what's been done in the communities, I guess.
again, it's what you all decide to do with it and make happen with it, and having it available electronically or in paper form, libraries, Chamber of Commerce, city website, local historical societies. Just the more it can be accessible is the best way to have it used. And obviously our office retains copies of it, and those are available and should be more available through our online mapping, because we're in the project of trying to link all National Register nominations to sites on our online mapping. And as right now, we're also doing Ohio Historic our survey to Ohio Historic Inventory. But we can always send out copies of it too. But yes,
one final credit.
It's meant to be used.
I don't want to forget that one. I know you don't want to credit, but in the early stage, you were very helpful, very beneficial through getting off the ground of this project, with your knowledge of the buildings and the history and process. And it was really very much a team effort. And credit you for being on the board, but also regional planning did volunteer a great deal of energy on this too. And I want to thank
I know for folks who are building owners who are looking to take advantage of some of these credits and do renovations and stuff like that, talk to your bank. The bank can be a good partner. So if you don't know a good banker,
Well, I put some of my cards out. Again, I can't stress enough, contact, email myself or Nathalie or Vaughn. We can hook you up with, as I said, Lisa Brownell, LISA BROWNL. Brownell. LL. But she, the Ohio Department of Development, Ohio Historic Preservation Tax Credit. That will get you to the information about the state tax credit, Ohio History Connection, State Historic Preservation Office. That'll get you more information about everything we've talked about tonight, information about the upcoming board meeting, how to register for it, and also information about the historic tax credits. And for that matter, more information about those federally funded, the coordinating planning for federal projects as well.
Is that also where the submission for Marion before December 3rd is going to live, is on that website link to the meeting itself? Does it also have the attachments of these are the projects that are being submitted, or where's the
there will be there's a linkage to get to those, yes. So, agenda, yes. Okay.
Nathalie, I just want to thank you again. Your presentation was very interesting to me. I knew all the buildings, but the way you connected them, both in terms of the time period, how that connected with the development of the city and downtown, and then even the different styles of them, I found very educational.
Great. Thank you. Thanks.
maybe we can get a re-up picture of the Harding Center without all the bricks falling off.
That's part of history.
We could use that repair as one of the examples.
Well, I think you all hosted a coffee through the Ohio Heritage Ohio a few years ago. always talking about this downtown district, so.
Yeah, this was quite long.
Well, there's a few more steps to go.
Thank you, Zimmer. How are you?